World War I is the event that pretty much caused all other conflicts in the 20th century that came afterwards. And not only did about 17 million people die in World War I, but it led to things like World War II, the Russian Revolution, the spread of communism, the Cold War, Vietnam, Korea, all of these other wars that claimed countless millions of lives too. So, how did this war that caused so much suffering begin? Well, as the world entered the 1910s, Europe was really on the brink of war, and there were four main reasons for this, and we can break it down into this acronym MAIN. The first long-term cause of World War I was militarism. Militarism is when nations build up their militaries dramatically with new weapons, new technology, and at this time you have a lot of new military technology, and nations are building up their militaries. And eventually, if you're spending so much money on weapons, you're going to want a chance to use them. Alliances, that's the second long-term cause of World War I. This is when nations make agreements with each other to fight on the side of the nation you're making an agreement with if a war breaks out. So you had several secret alliances forming to where when the war broke out, it wasn't just a war between two countries, but between dozens of countries. The third long-term cause of World War I is imperialism, when nations take over smaller, weaker nations and make them colonies. Colonizing regions of the world, competing with other nations in doing so. Europe had been doing this for decades, especially in Africa and in South and Southeast Asia. And this is what really made World War I a world war instead of just a European war, because you have people from all of these different colonies answering the call to come help their colonizing country win this war against their rivals. And then the last long-term cause of this war was nationalism. Nationalism is an intense pride in one's country, sometimes accompanied by prejudice against people from other countries. So you're kind of wanting to win a war to prove that you and your people are the best. So all of this created what historians call the powder keg. Europe was basically this big barrel of gunpowder waiting for a single spark to set it all ablaze. And the spark that lit the so-called powder keg was the assassination of the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Austria-Hungary had been one of the largest empires in Europe for a very long time. They dominated much of Central Europe during the time of the Habsburgs. And on June 28, 1914, a guy named Gavrilo Princip, who was a Serbian terrorist, a part of a terrorist group called the Black Hand, he assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, and they were the heirs to the throne of Austria-Hungary. Now, after this assassination, Austria-Hungary then declared war on Serbia, because that's where Gavrilo Princip was from. And then during the next 2 months, nation after nation joined the war on the side of their allies. So if you look at the map there, the countries in the pink became known as the Central Powers, and the countries in the green became known as the Allied Powers. The Allied Powers included Great Britain, France, and Belgium, all who came to the aid of Serbia. And then the Central Powers included Germany and the Ottoman Empire, who came to the aid of Austria-Hungary. Now, the United States was one of the strongest, if not the strongest country in the world at this point. Remember, the 20th century is known as the American century, but the U.S. decided to remain neutral at the beginning for a number of reasons. First off, we said this isn't our fight. This is 3,000 miles away. And secondly, because if we were to enter this war, it was undecided which side we would even join. I mean, America has a lot of immigrants from both the Central Powers nations and the Allied Powers nations. And unlike in World War II, there wasn't a clear good guy or bad guy. Okay? It's not like Germany was evil at this point, or Russia was evil at this point in the same way that the Nazis or the Soviets were. This was basically a big disagreement that clashed into violence that killed millions. Now, due to the entrance of so many alliances, the conflict very quickly became the largest war in all of human history up to that time. It was originally just simply called the Great War, but many referred to it as the war to end all wars, because they believed that this war was so catastrophic, so bloody, that afterwards people would want nothing to do with war anymore. So this was not called World War I at the time, because we didn't know there was going to be a second one. It was simply called the Great War. Most of the fighting took place on two fronts, which means two basically long lines of battlefields, known as the Eastern Front and the Western Front. The Eastern Front was on the border of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia in Eastern Europe, and then the Western Front was mostly in France and Belgium. And the method of fighting that was used was called trench warfare. This is where both sides would dig deep trenches, deep ditches, to take cover in and to fight from. Now, the trenches stretched for miles, and battles often lasted weeks or even months. The logic behind trench warfare is people thought it would lead to fewer casualties because you're protected by the earth. But what this led to was way longer battles and therefore way more casualties, because if you're literally entrenched into the ground, there is no advancement, there is no retreat, and therefore battles never end, and they just take months and months. And you had this constant bombardment of artillery shells. Now you have bombs that you can lob a half a mile away to the enemy trench and kill people without even seeing them. Soldiers would often catch dysentery or trench foot, all sorts of other diseases in these muddy, swampy trenches. Occasionally, soldiers would go over the top into the land in between the two sides of the trenches, known as no man's land, because you basically couldn't survive. Because think about it, if you and your troops go over the top and charge at the enemy trenches, are they going to come out of their trenches and meet you in the middle? No, they're going to stay in their trenches, protected, and then just gun you down with machine guns. So trenches were bombarded just constantly, causing massive casualties and a very bloody stalemate. This is why after World War I, trench warfare was never used again. Here are just some pictures from the trenches. You see how deep they were and how there was, it was basically living in the earth. This is how muddy it would get. Imagine how unsanitary it was, especially when people had to use the restroom. Rats became a huge problem, and so did trench foot. People would literally lose toes because their feet would be wet and cold all the time in that mud. And so even when you didn't get killed by the enemy, you'd get killed by disease or other maladies. This is a picture of a troop, a regiment going over the top into no man's land. This is the area in between the trenches here where you would charge at the opposite trench. And this is what it looked like usually after a battle. And just for context here, this used to be a forest. This used to be a densely forested area of Europe. And because of the constant bombardment over years, it looked like the surface of the moon. Now, in this new century of progress in technology of the 20th century, new weapons were used in World War I. There are 5 new types of weapons that were used for the first time on a large scale in World War I. First would be submarines. This was the first time that submarines were used on a large scale. You had the very early submarines during the Civil War that could only fit about 8 people, but now you have these large submarines that can go underwater and fire torpedoes at the enemy. You also have tanks, which were designed in England to drive over trenches and protect you while you were doing so. You also have poison gas. Not only were enemies lobbing bombs into opposing trenches, but they were also lobbing mustard gas and other types of poisonous gas bombs that would blind the enemy or tear off their skin or fill up their lungs and kill them. Then you have airplanes. Airplanes were invented by the Wright brothers in 1903. Now here we are in 1914, and they are being used for the first time in warfare. And think of all you can do from an airplane. You can fly over trenches, drop bombs, lead to massive casualties. And then probably the new weapon that caused the most casualties was the machine gun. Now, 50 years before World War I, there was the American Civil War. And during the Civil War, a very good soldier could fire maybe 3 shots in a minute because you had to reload in between every shot. You had to tear open a gunpowder packet, pour it down the barrel, you had to drop the bullet down there, get the ramrod shaft down, and then aim and fire. And the very best soldiers could do it 3 times in a minute. Now with a machine gun, it literally feeds the bullets into the gun to where hundreds of bullets can be shot in a minute, and you don't even have to be a good shot. You can just move the barrel of the gun around and just kind of sweep and get everybody in your path. So all of these weapons led to massive casualties. Here's just brief descriptions of a few of the major battles in the war. If you look at this map here, you see the Eastern Front over here in Russia, and then you see the Western Front over here in France. The Battle of Tannenberg was the first major battle of the war. This was in August of 1914. So remember, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand took place in June of that year, and then by the end of the summer, the fighting had commenced. This took place on the Eastern Front. Germany defeated Russia in this 5-day battle, and 100,000 people died, most of them Russian. Now, the fact that it only took 5 days implies that the trenches had not been established yet. In fact, it was right after this battle that the trenches were dug in, and a lack of progress ensued. But the fact that most of the casualties here were Russian made Germany very optimistic for the war, and it took the Russian army months to recover. This war was disastrous for everyone involved, even the winners, but it was most disastrous for Russia. No country lost more people than Russia did in World War I. The First Battle of the Marne happened after Germany invaded Belgium and France. As a part of what was called the von Schlieffen Plan, Germany invaded Belgium and then France in order to try to get them out of the war quickly so that they could then focus on Russia. It didn't work for them, but that was the plan. And the Allied powers defeated Germany in this 5-day battle near Paris. This halted Germany's advance into France and established the Western Front, which basically remained unchanged for 4 years. And just to illustrate that, there was a second Battle of the Marne that took place 4 years later in the exact same spot, showing that no progress had been made on either side for 4 years on the Western Front, but millions of people had died in trying to make progress for their side. The Battle of Gallipoli was the major battle against the Ottoman Empire, who, remember, fought in the Central Powers alongside Austria, Hungary, and Germany. And this was a lengthy battle. It was not trench warfare, mostly. It was not trench warfare. It was a naval invasion by the British and French troops to try to invade the Ottoman Empire by sea and in that way resupply Russia. It was a Central Powers victory. Now, the British attack was led by the ANZAC forces. ANZAC stands for Australia and New Zealand Army Corps. And these were forces from the British colonies of Australia and New Zealand. This really shows that this truly was a world war. The Battle of Verdun took place from February to December of 1916. One battle taking 11 months. This is the longest battle in all of world history. It took place over the course of 302 days. Over 300,000 people were killed, and it took place in the trenches on the Western Front. The French finally defeated the Germans in this very, very lengthy battle and gained just a little bit of land, just advanced a tiny bit before the trenches had to be reestablished. Never before in history had battles lasted this long, and it's because of the trench warfare that that's happening. Then you have the Battle of the Somme. Now, this took place at the same time as the Battle of Verdun. It didn't take quite as long. It took place from July to November of 1916, so only 4 months, which is still an incredibly long time. But even more people died in the Battle of the Somme. It was the bloodiest battle of World War I. In fact, it was the bloodiest battle in world history up to that point. Not until World War II would battle casualties exceed that number. About 500,000 people were killed in this catastrophe. And one thing that's shocking here is that neither side won. Neither side decisively won this battle. Never before had single battles taken so many lives when there was literally nothing to show for it. So the United States remained neutral at the beginning of World War I for a couple of reasons. One is because the U.S. still followed the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine, proposed by President James Monroe and his Secretary of State John Quincy Adams in the 1820s, the Monroe Doctrine basically said we're going to draw a line down the Atlantic Ocean. And everything to the west, everything in the Western Hemisphere, Europe should not get involved in. Europe should not get involved in the affairs of Latin America. That's basically the United States' sphere. And then it also said that America would not get involved in things to the east of that line, anything in the Eastern Hemisphere, Europe, Africa, Asia, that was all Europe's sphere. And so we wanted to stay out of World War I because we thought it wasn't our business. We wanted to stick with the Monroe Doctrine. And we saw what was happening over there. We saw how these Europeans were killing each other in droves, and we didn't want any part of that. Now, after years of neutrality, there were two events that caused the United States to join World War I. First was the sinking of the Lusitania. Sorry about that. I'm not going to start over, though. The first was the sinking of the Lusitania. This was a passenger ship in 1915, and this was attacked by a German U-boat, a German submarine, a passenger ship. So civilians were targeted here. 2,000 people were killed by this German torpedo, and including 128 Americans. So the fact that now American casualties were a part of this war, all of a sudden America said, okay, now this involves us. Now we are at least not neutral in mind. We at least at this point said we want Germany to lose, so we'll supply arms to the Allied powers. But then the event that caused the United States to join the war and actually fight the Germans was the Zimmermann Note, or the Zimmermann Telegram. And this was sent in 1917. This is when Germany sent Mexico a telegram that promised to give back Texas and New Mexico to Mexico if Mexico joined the war on Germany's side. Now, Texas, New Mexico, that whole territory had been taken from Mexico with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in the late 1840s when the U.S. won the Mexican-American War. And Mexico presumably wanted that territory back. However, when Germany sent this telegram, Mexico declined their offer. They didn't want to join that war either, but it was intercepted by the Allies. And they showed the Americans, hey, Germany is trying to take away your territory. You need to protect your country and join the war. And this is what convinced most Americans to join the war. Now, Woodrow Wilson was president during World War I, and his policy toward the European war for the first half of it was isolationist. He believed in the Monroe Doctrine. He prided himself in keeping the U.S. neutral. In fact, when he ran for re-election in 1916, his campaign was, "I kept us out of the war." And then, after getting reelected, the Zimmermann Telegram happened, and he said, okay, we got to go to war. So after the Zimmermann Note, he convinced Congress to declare war on Germany, and the phrase he used to convince Americans of the justness of this war was, he said, this is a war to make the world safe for democracy. Basically, if we don't fight and win this war, democracy will die in the world. So what resulted from the U.S. entering the war on the sides of the Allies in 1917? Well, it was a huge shift, both in morale as well as in practical improvement. So with America's military strength, and especially America's air power, the Allies quickly gained a very decisive advantage. Now, the air power was really important because the U.S. had invented flight and therefore were years ahead of the rest of the world in airplane technology. So with American planes coming to Europe, having superiority in the air, the Allies were able to very quickly gain a big advantage. After the U.S. entered the war, it became clear that the Allies were going to win. It was just a matter of time. Now, unfortunately, racial segregation applied to the Army as it did to civilian life in America at that time. Nonetheless, 400,000 African Americans served in World War I. They had to serve in segregated units, but they served very bravely. Only a few were permitted to become officers, and all of them were barred from the Marine Corps, so the majority of them were in the Army. Now, one regiment that was particularly brave and accomplished was the 369th Infantry Regiment. They were nicknamed the Harlem Hellfighters, and this was an all-black battalion in the war. They spent 191 days in the frontline trenches on the Western Front, which was more than any other American unit. They also suffered the most losses of any American regiment, with 1,500 casualties, but they were very accomplished and played a large role in the U.S. helping the Allies to win this war. The Battle of Amiens took place in August of 1918. It was the last major battle of World War I. So we're about 4 years since the beginning of the war. Tens of millions of people have died, many more have been wounded, and now we get to the Battle of Amiens. And this was the days where the trench warfare system was finally broken. This began the Allies' 100 Days Offensive. It broke the stalemate, it pushed the Germans back, it ended trench warfare permanently, and it led to the end of the war. Once again, apologize for that bell. I am at work, but I'm not going to start over. The armistice. So the armistice was the surrender of Germany and the Central Powers. This ended the war officially. Armistice means ceasefire, and it was signed on November 11th, 1918. A national holiday was made called Armistice Day to honor veterans from World War I, and later it was renamed Veterans Day in order to honor veterans from all wars, not just World War I. After the war ended, Woodrow Wilson strongly believed that we needed a League of Nations, an international organization, in order to try to prevent another war like this from happening. So the League of Nations, their main goal was to keep the peace, to resolve conflicts between nations before it comes to war. Now, one major country that voted not to join the League of Nations was the United States. Even though it was Woodrow Wilson's idea, the U.S. voted not to join the League of Nations because we wanted to return to the Monroe Doctrine. We wanted to return to isolationism. We said, okay, we stepped across the boundary because y'all begged us to, and now we're coming back. We don't want anything more to do with you crazy Europeans. Fight your own wars from now on. We're going to stay in our boundaries here. Now, this organization was the precursor to what would become the United Nations after World War II. The treaty that resolved World War I was called the Treaty of Versailles, and it was signed on June 28, 1919, the 5-year anniversary of the beginning of the war. And this really clarified the results of World War I. First off, it laid total responsibility for the war on Germany, and it blamed them for everything. At the Paris Peace Conference, you have major leaders from the Allied nations. You have Vittorio Orlando from Italy. You have Georges Clemenceau from France. You have David Lloyd George from Britain. And you have Woodrow Wilson from the United States. And most of them were so upset at Germany and had hated them for the past 5 years and blamed Germany for the death of their boys, that they wanted to put all the blame on Germany in order to get revenge on them for their role that they played in this war. Now, to be clear, Germany deserved some of the blame, for sure, but not all of it. I mean, they weren't the ones who fired the first shot. They weren't the first ones to declare war. There was a lot of blame to go around. However, people need a scapegoat, and therefore Germany was blamed for everything. By the way, this was a huge, huge mistake, which we'll get to in a second. It required Germany to pay reparations to the Allies, basically as a financial apology for all they did during the war. They had to reduce their military. It took away a huge amount of Germany's territory. Specifically, it took away all 4 of their African colonies and gave them to Britain and France. And it also redrew many of the borders on the European map. If you look at the top map, that is the map of Europe in 1914, and at the bottom is the map of Europe in 1919. As you see, there are many more countries and fewer empires. The First World War led to the collapse of the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. So how did World War I eventually lead to World War II? Because World War II broke out 20 years after World War I ended. So why? How did one lead to the other? Well, the harshness with which the Treaty of Versailles treated Germany led most Germans to become both oppressed, financially depressed and impoverished, and it led them to become resentful. Because in addition to being humiliated by the treaty, Germany became deeply in debt, which led to tons of suffering and desperation. I often ask my students, would you rather be punched in the face or have someone spit in your face? And it's usually 50-50 because a punch in the face hurts more. It could lead to damage, but a spit in the face is so disrespectful. And so a lot of people would prefer to be punched in the face. But the Treaty of Versailles was a punch and a spit in the face of Germany because it humiliated them and it also made them hurt financially, which is what the Allies wanted. This desperation and anger that Germans had toward the Allied powers for basically ruining their country led the German people to embrace a leader who promised to bring revenge to the Allied powers and to restore Germany to what it had been before. And of course, that man was Adolf Hitler.